So I've talked a lot about adenosine triphosphate. Let's take a closer look at the actual molecule adenosine triphosphate. I just think it highlights kind of how this system works and how ATP is involved in contractions. But adenosine triphosphate is a molecule. It's named for its parts. It has an adenosine portion, which is on this graphical representation. It's this portion of the molecule here. An adenosine molecule that's bound to 3 phosphate groups. That's the triphosphate. So we see a phosphate group here, here, and here. So 3 phosphates are bound to this adenosine. Now I know we're not chemists and all, but what I think is useful is sort of understand what's happening here. So there are really high energy bonds that bond these phosphate groups to the overall molecule. And when we break off the phosphate group, when we break off the 3rd phosphate group, energy is released. And it's that energy that the myosin uses to grab onto and pull on the adenosine, allowing for muscle contraction. So muscle contraction is fueled by the energy released, the chemical energy that's released from breaking the bond, and it turns it into this mechanical energy, allowing the molecules to pull on one another, which is pretty amazing in itself. The ATP, when it is broken down, becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate group that we just broke off, right? And then energy is released, and this energy is used for muscle contraction. So that's what's happening each time you contract a muscle. ATP is produced. It utilizes an enzyme called ATPase, and we end up with ADP, a phosphate group, and energy. So this ends up sitting in the cell. So this is sitting in the muscle cell, not really useful for anything, but it's there. Now, to make more ATP, simply what happens is we turn this formula in reverse. We take energy here from maybe breaking down glucose. Okay, we can break down glucose, we can break down lipids, we can break down phosphocreatine. All of those things release energy. We can use that energy to take the ADP and stick the phosphate group back to it, and we end result with ATP. So ATP needs to be resynthesized to fuel additional muscle activity once skeletal muscle runs out of its initial supply of ATP. So all 3 of these energy systems are going to allow for this to occur. It's going to break some other molecule down, use that energy to stick the phosphate group back to the adenosine diphosphate, and now we have more ATP. Each of the energy systems can do this in slightly different ways. It uses separate or different types of molecules or inputs and so on. And we're going to look at each of the energy systems here in a second. But basically, they're all going to be doing this same thing, turning the formula in reverse from breaking down ATP to making ATP. The synthesis of ATP is really key. If you're working with athletes or you're trying to maximize somebody's performance, often the limiting factor in physical performance is the ability to supply ATP to working muscles in a significant enough amount. So if you watch the Olympics and you see someone doing a race like a 200 or a 400, they run as fast as they can for the whole time, right? But they can't go as fast as they could during the 100-meter sprint. And that's because their body cannot produce ATP quickly enough to keep them at that speed. So in that case, the case of a sprinter, the limiting factor in performance often is the ability to supply ATP quickly enough. If you look at endurance runners, you look at marathon runners and so on, they run at an incredibly quick rate each mile, right? They're running mile speeds that I couldn't even run for 1 mile, let alone 26. But their limiting factor in physical performance often also is the ability to synthesize ATP quickly enough. And while they're relying on very different energy systems than the sprinter might, they need to supply ATP to the working muscle But to do that, they also have to supply glucose and oxygen to the working muscle to utilize the third energy system, the aerobic energy system. So often the limiting factor in physical performance is the ability to synthesize ATP quickly enough. So an understanding of that can help us in terms of designing training programs and so on, because our training programs should be aimed at training the different energy systems. If I work with a sprinter, I want to train their energy systems that are going to produce ATP quickly. If I'm working with an endurance athlete, I want to make sure I'm targeting the aerobic energy system and maximizing its ability to synthesize ATP. So again, it's vital to understand these processes to maximize performance. And again, remember that we can formulate or synthesize more ATP by breaking down other molecules. So the energy systems we're going to look at are going to either break down phosphocreatine, which is a molecule that's stored in skeletal muscle in small amounts, but with training, we can get your skeletal muscle to store greater amounts. And that breakdown of phosphocreatine can release energy that we can use to make more ATP. In our aerobic system and our anaerobic glycolysis, we can break down glucose and glycogen, again, forms of sugar or carbohydrate that's found in skeletal muscle, but also found in the bloodstream, stored in the liver as well. We can use that to fuel the formation of more ATP. And then finally, we can also use glucose, glycogen, lipids, proteins in the presence of oxygen to form more ATP. In terms I've used already that you should make sure you know to understand these different energy systems. Anaerobic pathways, the term anaerobic means without the presence of oxygen. It does not require oxygen to work. So the PC, or the immediate energy system, and anaerobic glycolysis are going to be systems that do not require oxygen. So they do not rely on the ability to deliver oxygen to working muscle. The aerobic pathways are going to rely on the presence of oxygen. And there is some oxygen already stored attached to myoglobin in skeletal muscle, but we also can obviously deliver oxygen by breathing and so on. And again, the aerobic pathways are going to be oxidative phosphorylation, which we'll go over these terms here in the future slides.